I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. I bought a copy of Morkborg, and this was not easy to do because it's largely sold out everywhere you might go looking for it. But I wanted to have it in a hard copy because it's an artsy book, and I feel that artsy books belong on glossy paper and in hardcovers. But it was sold out everywhere. So what I did was that I bought the PDF, and as far as I'm concerned, I have the right to print out any PDF that I own, and I put it together on Lulu entirely as a personal project. Private, so no one could see it, and I had it printed and bound in hardback to my own personal design. So that's why my copy of Morkborg looks unique, and that's obviously quite punk of it. It also means I've got some nice space I can cut and paste some extra material into if I feel up to it, which would be even more punk. So it's just worth mentioning here that Lulu's hardcovers used to be hellishly expensive, and shipping them used to be hellishly expensive. Their full colour printing process was also not necessarily that great in the past, and was also hellishly expensive. All of that seems to have improved immeasurably, though a note of caution would be that Lulu uses different printers in different areas to print their books for them, though they do try to get a consistent standard. But this came out cost effective, about the same as the £30 that an official proper copy would have cost me, a little bit less when you take shipping into account. The quality is right up there now with professionally printed proper print run books, or even better than some, because a lot of people get things cheaply printed in China. So well worth doing, and if you own any of my PDFs, you're perfectly welcome to get them printed and bound at print shops and so on. It's your right anyway, but you know, it's cool. Get books printed how you want them. Compile them. I did that with Dragon Warriors. I bought all of the books and had them bound into one gigantic tome. It's worth doing, and it's also worth noting that full colour is now affordable to print at Lulu, and hardcover is now a much better binding and printing process now at Lulu. So that's got some interesting implications for material that I might produce. Okay, so what is Morkborg? Morkborg is an old school-ish game, not particularly derived from D&D, but that doesn't mean it's not old school in temperament and style and presentation and ideas and so on, similar to the way I'd say, well, Dragon Warriors is an old school game, even though it is old, it's not D&D. There's this idea that old school must mean D&D or a D&D derived rule set. I don't think that's the case, and I think it's high time we spread our wings a little more. I would be tempted to retroclone Dragon Warriors if I didn't know the guy behind Serpent King, and if I didn't know Dave Morris, but I might put out some feelers to see whether that's something I could do as an old school set of publications anyway. But yeah, it's old school in temperament, it's old school in simplicity, it's old school or how we used to perhaps imagine old school was back when it was old school. It's very much from the era of punk and metal, though transfigured through something more and different. They're calling it Artpunk. I think it's quite, not derivative, but inspired by the success of Zack Smith, and I also think it's inspired by the consistent but constantly renewed interest in grim, dark settings, which I'm obviously putting something out for soon, because this is a grim, dark setting, if it can be said to be a setting at all. It's very weird, it's very strange, it's very metal, it's very punk. They call it Artpunk, and I guess that's as good a description as any. After all, you've got cyberpunk, clockpunk, steampunk, bamboo punk. Why not Artpunk? There are problems associated with that, though. I've reviewed 2 books recently, both to do with Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which I think also inspired this. One being Vornheim by Zack Smith. Controversy aside, it's a very interesting and almost dream state-like book, and this is probably closest in temperament and content to that. The other one was Seclusium of Orphone, which was written by D. Vincent Baker, and that, while it was a lot more straightforward in presenting its information and what it was for and so on, it just didn't land for me. This falls somewhere between. It doesn't have the same ease. It doesn't have the same balance between usability and inspiration that, say, Vornheim does. And it's not as usable as D. Vincent Baker's stuff is. It's somewhere in between. It's more phantasmagorical in the way that Vornheim and similar Red and Pleasant Land and so on are. It's more that way. Possibly too much. Possibly sliding somewhat into pretension here and there. But it's still quite good. One thing I always hated about White Wolf games was the way in which they hid important game information in interminable purple prose fiction, clearly written by frustrated novelists, and every narrator was unreliable, so you couldn't get any hard and fast information on what the game world was supposed to be like, where anything particularly was, what was true and what wasn't. To an extent that fitted, but as a games master or a storyteller, you want to have some kind of idea, and if you make choices about canon for your campaign and you proceed upon that basis and then something else comes out that contradicts it, or a player has a character that's brought into something that you've decided not to include, it's difficult. So they buried a lot of useful information in great big tracts of nonsense. This whole book is a great big tract of nonsense, and it's not just the setting material that's hidden away in that way. It's the rules themselves are kind of hidden away and hard to find. I should point out that the printing wasn't perfect. There were some problems with pages that were all black, so I printed them at home, and I'm going to glue them into this or stitch them into it or something, because that's punk too. But everything is higgledy-piggledy. Everything is jumbled up. Every page or spread is presented in its own style, and while there are commonalities, it doesn't continue from page to page. The art definitely has precedence over the game, and even the punk, I would say. It's full of random tables, but they're not big enough for your experiences with those tables to be truly novel. I've been challenging myself a bit to introduce more random elements and to learn to cope with them in the games that I run, which is something I used to do and then fell away from. A recent D&D game for Tabletopless had an enormous pyramid appear due to the use of a bag of beans, which completely destroyed one plot line and introduced an ancient mummy lord, which I now have to figure out what to do with. There are plenty of random tables in here. I just don't think they're big enough, they're expanded enough, they're open enough for it to really work. Once you've played maybe 3 sessions, maybe 3 campaigns, if you stick with the same characters, the roles are going to get old, so you're going to have to come up with your own stuff, which obviously isn't an issue for most people, most experienced games masters, but it is going to get repetitive fairly quickly if you just stick to the random tables. When you're gauging a book, you have to go by what you've got, right? The index is actually good, which is unusual for role-playing games, and a bit out of place given everything else about the aesthetic of Morkborg. but it needs it because everything is scattered all over the place. So it's not an easy book to reference at the table, even with the index. What I would probably do if I were you was I would use the index to put together cheat sheets for character creation, combat, and the few random tables that are going to come up the most times. That's what I would recommend. So it has a good index, but even so, everything is all over the place and not necessarily that easy to read where you do find it, because a lot of the fonts and so on are overwrought. Now, admittedly, the rules tend to be presented in a much more clear fashion, so they have thought about it, which is good. So how do you go about playing Morkborg? Well, first you're going to need a character. You get randomized equipment. There are optional character classes, but I think it's fairly easy in scope to make up your own, so that's what I would probably recommend. You can either have no particular class or you can randomize your class. There's tables for backgrounds and things. These are all quite random, but it's likely to turn up too often because the tables aren't really big enough to guarantee a reasonable degree of randomness. And you have powers. Powers are weird things that you can activate a certain number of times. I guess they fulfill the role of spells, but they're much more esoteric and weird, and they don't have to just be magical. You have a handful of abilities: agility, presence, strength, and toughness. These are given a -3 to +3 score, similar to D&D, but the scale is different. One affects your hit points. You roll the other things plus the bonus to do stuff. You can make your character better later on. For most things, the difficulty is about 10 to 12. 12 is the typical difficulty in combat. To do things, you're generally going to be rolling a d20 plus ability against a difficulty between 6 and 18. Weapons do a certain amount of damage, a dice of damage. Armor takes away from that damage. Yeah, that's pretty much it. There's no real skills. There are some special abilities according to these classes, which again are optional. Let me just see if I can find one. So Gutterborn Scum begins with one speciality, which is their special ability. So one of these is Coward's Jab, which is backstab, right? So when attacking by surprise, test your agility, difficulty 10. On a success, you automatically hit once with a light one-handed weapon, dealing an extra +3 to your damage roll. All very simple. But then that presents its own problems, because when combat and so on is so simple, a lot comes down to interpretation, and that puts a lot of strain on both the players and the games masters. The players, because they can't easily pull off something cool unless you've got a really flexible, improvisational and adaptive games master, which I pride myself as being, but a lot of people aren't that. So combat, which is so much of a focus in so many games, especially dungeoneering and so on, rapidly devolves into roll versus roll versus roll versus roll versus roll versus roll, and you don't get that kind of narrative impetus or those tactical choices that make it interesting. I do my best in Dragon Warriors, but it's still difficult. And running the D&D game, I've got players who keep saying they want to do things like target the weak points and so on, and D&D doesn't really have rules for that. So you have to make an effort. You have to up your game, or you have to adapt the rules to allow for special tactics and so on that players might be making. Yeah, it's the problem with simple games. It's the big problem with simple games and OSR type games. The tactical choices just aren't particularly available. It's relatively easy to house rule, but again, you've got to judge a game by what's written down. All of the rolls are made by the PCs. They roll to both attack and defend. Monsters don't have to make any rolls, so it's similar to Numenera in that. So generally it's difficulty 12 to hit something and difficulty 12 to dodge something, and that's basically how it works. The players make all the rolls, so watch them like a fucking hawk when you try running this. I think that's about it. It's a very, very simple game. It's very easy to get an impression of the mood that they're after from the art. that's depicted through the book. They're definitely going for a sort of black metal aesthetic sort of thing. So that's easy to see throughout the book. It is hyper stylized, very pretty. It's a curiosity to own. I'm not sure about playing it, but it's certainly good inspiration, if nothing else, and perhaps opens out how we consider old school as we move forward. Definitely worth a go. I might try running a couple of sessions of it at some point to see how it goes. Slap some Goatcraft or Primitive Knot on the stereo, maybe some Blythe Power for some folk punk to mix it up. Make up a strange, screwed up character and get involved in some weird, symphonic, black metal, art punk strangeness. Style, it is an art object, style 5. Substance, thin on the ground, difficult to use, difficult to interpret. So I'm afraid in terms of substance, I can really only give it a 2. So that gives it an overall score of 3.5 stars out of 5, or 7 out of 10 if you want to be a dick about it. Worth buying as a curiosity and from a game designer's point of view and a layout point of view. That's where the real value of it is, I think, in pushing the envelope of the art form in terms of the book presentation, if not the game itself. Zang. "Rrrr," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice, from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.